He was Ireland's most famous mastermind.
He was a very intelligent man, and he's the most dedicated criminal I ever met.
He became a living legend.
Every major crime he pulled, he planned it to the last detail. He didn't get the nickname, the General, for nothing.
He organized one of the biggest art heists in the world.
They were all going to be set up for life. They were all going to be millionaires.
Russborough House near Dublin, Ireland, home of De Beers diamond mining heir Sir Albert Beit. In 1986, Russborough boasted one of the best private art collections in the world, worth more than $60 million. Among the paintings was Vermeer's much acclaimed Lady Writing a Letter, itself valued at $30 million. The paintings were protected by a sophisticated alarm system considered unbeatable. And the Irish police, known as the Garda, always kept a close eye on the mansion, making regular drive-bys during their nightly rounds. One night in May, a police patrol car made a routine check around 1 a.m. Everything was fine. Then, about an hour later, Russborough's alarms started blaring. With the Garda en route, the mansion's caretaker, Colonel O'Shea, switched off the alarm and raced to the gallery. But there was no one there. Nothing out of place.
The patrol car went to Russborough House and met Colonel O'Shea. Colonel O'Shea had said he'd checked the house, it took a false alarm, and there was no need to worry. They talked to him for a short while and then left.
Everyone was satisfied that all was well. O'Shea turned the alarm back on and returned to bed. What happened next would become one of Ireland's great criminal mysteries.
At 9:15 on the following morning, I got a call from Colonel O'Shea to say that 18 paintings had been stolen.
Of the 100 paintings in the collection, they had taken the 18 most valuable works. Police Superintendent Sean Feely rushed over to Russborough House.
The paintings were gone, frames and all, and the back window in the French door had been broken and the door had been opened. The door was directly behind heavy drapes, so you wouldn't see it. If you went in to check the room, you wouldn't know how they got in without pulling back the heavy drapes.
As they looked for clues, police found that the infrared alarm system had been deactivated. And on the grounds, there were a number of sticks with white plastic bags on them, leading into the woods. This was no amateur operation. It was a perfect heist. Sometime after the false alarm at 2:10 a.m., someone broke into Russborough House and disappeared with $60 million in rare paintings.
It caused shockwaves, not just in the police force, but in the government circles. It was the second largest art robbery in the world. Well, it was just quite the most spectacular crime of the century.
18 irreplaceable masterpieces were long gone, and the police didn't have a single lead. They suspected that a sophisticated gang of international art thieves had plundered the gallery. They had no idea that the real mastermind was right under their noses. At Ireland's Russborough House, Colonel O'Shea awoke to find $60 million worth of paintings taken from the walls. Police suspected an international gang of art thieves was to blame. Little did they know, the real mastermind was closer to home. The man behind the crime was Martin Cahill, a notorious Irish criminal gangster known as the General.
He was intelligent, very ruthless, a master planner.
The man who'd stolen millions had started life dirt poor in the slums of Dublin.
A vast, grey, sprawling, run-down, rat-infested, poverty-stricken black spot of a housing estate. It was grim. He had a difficult upbringing.
Martin and his brothers saw crime as the only way to even the score between the haves and the have-nots.
He thought of himself as a kind of Robin Hood. He was very kind and very generous to his friends and family.
Over the next 2 decades, Cahill honed his skills, growing from a petty thief into a criminal mastermind.
Martin was a dedicated criminal. He was so precise, so obsessive about the planning of a job and the execution of a job that he got the nickname the General.
He was cautious to the extreme, only working with close friends and relatives. And whenever he was in public, he hid his face so that strangers wouldn't know what he looked like. Cahill's gang pulled off a series of successful jewelry and bank robberies in Dublin. But he was still hungry for the big one, a crime that would net him millions. That was when he zeroed in on Rusborough House. Cahill knew nothing about art, but he knew how to move stolen goods.
Is he believed that the world was full of dodgy multi-billionaires who could pay $30, $40 million for a Vermeer or a Goya.
In the spring of 1986, Cahill was a frequent visitor to the Rusborough House Gallery.
He became an art lover. He went down and he strolled around and he got brochures and he studied the Metsus and the Goya and the Vermeers.
But it wasn't just the paintings that Cahill was studying.
And he'd look at the locations, and in the process of checking out the house, he would also obviously look at the electronic devices.
Cahill worked out a way of beating the alarm. He checked out the windows and doors, deciding which were the most vulnerable. And he memorized the layout of the house so he could find his way around during the strike.
He planned meticulously for 9 Sundays on the trot.
In the weeks leading up to the robbery, he and 2 associates dug a pit in the woods in the Dublin mountains not far from Rusborough House. They planned to stash the paintings there until the heat died down. After months of preparation, the general was finally ready to put his battle plan into action. Every step was choreographed with military precision. Just after midnight, the men rendezvoused in the woods behind the mansion. While the team waited in their jeeps, Cahill and 2 associates went ahead on foot.
He decided to hit it at the rear of the building. He just walked across the fields in the dark, placed sticks in the ground at intervals. Each stick had a white plastic bag attached to it.
The white bags, visible in the dark, marked the route to the house.
They then went up to the window, taped the glass, obviously to stop it from making noise. Broke the glass and got into the house, and immediately they went in. Microwave system, alarm system went off.
Setting off the alarm was all part of the general's plan.
One of his men deactivated the main sensors in the room, but they wanted to take the paintings. It all took seconds. And then they retreated. They closed the window, went out, and went back and hid in the bushes.
The caretaker, Colonel O'Shea, was the first to respond. The alarm had also gone through to the local police station.
Police arrived, the team were in place, Cahill's gang were watching all of this happening.
The people in the house checked it out, saw there hadn't been a break-in. The guards came, it was a false alarm.
Nobody noticed the missing window pane behind the drapes.
They satisfied themselves, the police, that everything was in order, all the paintings were on the wall. And they left. In minutes, as they saw as the lights of the Garda car disappeared and the great house was once again plunged into darkness.
With the infrared sensors now inactive, Cahill was ready to go with stage 2 of his plan. He called in the rest of his troops.
Now, they went in, opened the bay window, and they had the whole Rossborough house themselves.
Cahill let the rest of the gang in.
Pointed out the paintings to his guys, which ones he wanted to take.
Vermeer's Lady Writing a Letter worth $30 million topped the list. In total, the haul was worth twice that. Within minutes, the gang made their getaway.
Took the paintings out, loaded them into one of the jeeps, and drove off about maybe 4 or 5 miles away.
They got away hours before the alarm was raised. And in fact, they had so many paintings, they left the less valuable ones basically to be picked up in one of the abandoned vehicles. It was all very well done, very well thought out, and that was Martin's style.
As the gang dispersed, Cahill took the paintings to the hiding place in the Dublin mountains.
And really, that's where they were all deposited within maybe an hour after Rossborough. In other words, the job was done, the paintings were hidden, the men had gone before the alarm was raised.
The general had just pulled off one of the greatest art heists in history. But with the whole world looking for the famous works, had he painted himself into a corner? Irish gangster Martin Cahill, a.k.a. the General, had pulled off one of the biggest art robberies in the world, masterminding the theft of $60 million in paintings from Ireland's Rossborough house.
Basically, all the king's horses and all the king's men were pulled in on this one to investigate it. You had Scotland Yard, you had the FBI, you had police forces right throughout Europe and the world keeping an eye out for this, because the entire art world were aware of this. These were priceless gems.
At first, they thought they'd been hit by international art thieves, but word on the street pointed to a local gang.
It didn't take long for the police to catch up with them, because intelligence on the streets were, like when you use a large gang like that, no matter how silent they are, how secretive they are, somebody knows something. Cahill's gang were up to something.
But the police had no firm evidence it was Cahill, and they still had no idea where the paintings were. A few days after the heist, Cahill returned to the hiding place with one of his associates. He got a nasty surprise. The pictures appeared to have vanished.
One of the paintings had been completely covered in a sort of an efflorescence, like white dust from the weather.
Cahill thought the paintings had been stolen.
There was an amusing moment where his associate described to me how he started rubbing the painting. Saying, "James, what's this?" you know? And he started rubbing it, and then he said, "Ah, there it is." He said, "Who would have stolen the painting?" He found the painting again, basically. It's hiding under the white dust, because he had no knowledge at all of how do you look after paintings.
Cahill decided to move the paintings to Dublin for safekeeping, but he still didn't know how to turn his bounty into hard cash.
Suddenly he had these paintings and he didn't know what to do with them. And his contacts were very, very shaky.
The reality is, what Cahill didn't bargain on is that you can't sell these things. These paintings are impossible to sell.
Undercover agents posed as would-be buyers. But the general wasn't easily fooled.
He was conscious that the police could be in on any sting. He was terrified of that.
He had FBI officers in here posing as mafia art dealers, best of the world's undercover cops here. And Cahill, each time, just felt it wasn't right, and he pulled back.
Several months after the burglary, the general's army was getting restless for their piece of the pie.
He was under intense pressure from the other gang members who reckoned this was the big one. They were all going to be set up for life. They were all going to be millionaires.
But Cahill still couldn't find a buyer. He started to see the paintings as a jinx.
Within 2 years of the robbery, most of Cahill's loyal lieutenants were behind bars. The gang had been completely smashed up. And any criminal who will talk to about the curse of the Beit paintings, anyone seems to touch them just doesn't work out for them.
The paintings weren't faring too well either.
He had a huge problem. Some of them, I think, suffered quite serious damage, which again reduced their value. He probably would have been better off just taking the reward and handing them back.
But the reward money was less than $100,000. Cahill wanted much more. Finally, he found someone who was willing to pay. A Protestant paramilitary group in Northern Ireland approached Cahill. They had some buyers ready to make a deal.
And it was through them that he attempted to sell off some of the paintings. So he did dirty his bib, big time by that.
The Protestant group's buyers were in Turkey. Cahill let them have one of the Rusborough paintings for a trial run. At last, Cahill thought he could cash in. But by dealing with the Protestants, Cahill ticked off the rival Catholic organization, the Provisional IRA.
And suddenly here he was, giving these priceless paintings to the ultimate enemy. It was the worst thing he could have done in the world.
Once again, it seemed the Rusborough paintings were cursed. The Turkish buyers were really undercover police. The Protestant gang members were arrested, and the first of the Rusborough paintings was returned in a blaze of publicity. But now the IRA knew what Cahill had been up to.
As soon as that hit the international headlines, I think Martin Cahill, deep down in his soul, knew that he was a dead man walking.
Martin Cahill had masterminded a brilliant art heist, stealing $60 million in paintings from a private gallery. But selling the rare works was more difficult and dangerous than he ever imagined. Acting on tips, police recovered all but 2 of the paintings in raids throughout Europe. The most valuable piece, Vermeer's Lady Writing a Letter, was discovered in a car at the Antwerp airport. The police still couldn't prove that Cahill was behind the heist, but by now, they weren't the only ones after the general. Anxious to finally sell the paintings, Cahill had made the mistake of teaming up with a radical Protestant group, sworn enemies of the Provisional IRA. And now the IRA wanted revenge. In his desperation, the general had made a major tactical error.
Martin Cahill had contempt for all organizations. He felt the only organization worth looking after was Martin Cahill's organization. And his angering of the Provisional IRA led ultimately to his downfall and demise.
On August the 18th, 1994, a guy was standing at a corner of a street where Cahill drove every day in his trip between his sister-in-law's house and his wife's house.
The assassins had posed as corporation workers. They had been there all day, and they had been there the day before.
This guy walked forward and shot him 5 times, 6 times, point-blank range with a .357 Magnum, killing him instantly.
On the day that Cahill was gunned down, I was literally 1 minute's drive away, and I was the first police officer on the scene. The car was still running, and I rushed over, and I saw my old nemesis. And I put my hand inside his shirt to see if he had any pulse. He was dead.
Martin Cahill's death was front-page news.
Every newspaper in the country was sold out. There was not an issue of the paper left anywhere. ultimate bogeyman. They'd heard about his exploits, they were terrified by his exploits. Suddenly he was dead.
Martin was a squirreler, he was a hoarder, he would bury stuff, and only he knew where it was. So when Martin Cahill died, I'm afraid most of his fortune probably died with him. It's buried all over the place.
Ireland's greatest criminal mastermind was gone, but his legend lives on.
He would not be lost in the pantheon of supervillains from John Dillinger to Al Capone. He holds a special, grim fascination for certainly the people of this country, and more especially the police.